What's up everyone, I'm the one and only Zage, and a hot topic that's been in this community for a long time is who the strongest in history was. It's pretty much the GOAT debate of One Piece with different opinions spread throughout. I'll be evaluating the contenders for the title of the strongest in history to see who actually has the best case. As a disclaimer, I won't be covering any current day characters whose peak that we haven't seen yet, so those like Akainu, Blackbeard, and a future Pirate King Luffy obviously didn't make the cut. If you're new to the channel or you like content like this, consider subscribing to the channel and smashing the like button. That would be much appreciated now more than ever, as I have been away for a while now and the YouTube algorithm will make me pay for it, so yeah, pump this one up. Okay, so for the title of the strongest in history, there are 6 contenders that I've picked out. These 6 are popular characters that are usually in these conversations. I did leave out 2, that being Shiki and Sengoku, who, although they do have as much of a case as some that are going to be, in this conversation, they're just not that popular, so I'm not going to bother wasting my time talking about them, with all due respect. So I'll be splitting these 6 into 3 groups of 2 and then breaking them down, as there are similarities once you pair these guys up, and then by the end I'll probably give an order and then evaluate who the strongest in history actually is. So yeah, let's get started with the first group that I've called the Legends class. That will be Joy Boy and Ryuma. Originally, I didn't want to include these 2 in this conversation, as not much is actually known about them, but I know you lot would still mention them in the comments, so I might as well cover them, right? Joy Boy is portrayed to be the original arch nemesis of the world government. The Nikadel fruit, which was likely possessed by Joy Boy, is a fruit that the government have been trying to capture for the last 800 years, and they wanted Luffy dead during his fight with Kaido because of the fear that Luffy will awaken the fruit. Luffy became this era's Joy Boy, and after awakening his Devil Fruit, he gained the power that would help him ultimately defeat Kaido. As far as Ryuma, he lived his life as an undefeated great swordsman, a hero of Wano who protected the country from pirates and wild nobles who desired its resources. He has countless legends as a swordsman, one of them being slaying a dragon over the flower capital. Luffy defeating Kaido was considered a heroic act on par with Ryuma, which suggests Ryuma is capable of killing Kaido too, as the feat wouldn't be compared to his heroism if he wasn't capable of the same feat. Ryuma is also known as the God of the Blade, and a title like this may put it into perspective as to where he ranks all time, considering some of the strongest ever are also swordsmen too, like Rox and Roger. As far as we know though, this title is only known in Wano, but this would still suggest Ryuma is a greater swordsman than Oden, whose swordsmanship was so powerful that Kaido implied that he had the power to kill him. At the very least, Kaido put Oden in such high regards that when he was measuring Luffy's potential, Oden was part of the silhouette alongside Shanks, Roger, Whitebeard, and Rox. As of this recording, there isn't actually anything that really differentiates Ryuma and Joy Boy. They basically have the same portrayal as those that can defeat Kaido, which isn't really saying much in this conversation of the strongest of all time, when everyone on this list can defeat Kaido. Unless you consider Ryuma's title as the God of the Blade, then maybe by putting Ryuma above Roger and Rox, then we're getting somewhere. But the thing is, Ryuma and Joy Boy, like I said, don't really have much to put over one another, unless you consider the fact that because of Joy Boy's basically connection to Luffy and the fact that he was basically the old era Void Century version of Luffy, and Ryuma more so is paralleled with Zoro, and considering Luffy and Zoro, you know how that goes, Luffy always being stronger than Zoro for the most part, then more than likely Joy Boy will be stronger than Ryuma. But from an objective standpoint, they're basically the same in portrayal. Something that Ryuma does have over Joy Boy is the fact that he was undefeated, whereas Joy Boy is implied to have been defeated, as the current power of the world government and the ancient kingdom that Joy Boy was more than likely a part of was defeated. Imu also has a massive straw hat in his ice cellar or whatever, right? Which was probably possessed by Joy Boy. So Ryuma is undefeated, Joy Boy seems to have been defeated. So yeah, that's pretty much all there is to really talk about when it comes to Ryuma and Joy Boy. For the next group, this will be called the greatest class, which will be Garp and Roger. Garp is the most accomplished marine and Roger is the greatest pirate today. They were at the top of their respective fields and they had a strong rivalry as well. Garp is known to be the marine that has cornered Roger many times, and Roger says that they have nearly killed each other many times. Garp has never got the best of Roger and Roger has never got the best of Garp. There's no feat or narrative that suggests that one was definitively stronger than the other. There is a line that some quote in favor of Roger, and that's Shiki saying that worms like Garp and Sengoku couldn't have captured Roger. And by using this line, the argument essentially is that Roger narratively is stronger than Garp and Sengoku, as someone like Shiki, who is strong, right, and was Roger's rival, views them as inferior to Roger. Even though it's true that they didn't capture him and that Roger turned himself in, it's clear, and the context matters here, right? It's clear that Shiki was just being salty that he couldn't be the one to kill Roger before his capture, and even demanded for Roger to be released, as he believed if Roger were to die, it must be by his hand, as they were competing in the same era. Roger even acknowledges that if the Marines were to capture him, that they'd have to send either Garp or Sengoku. So Roger clearly doesn't think low of them the way Shiki does. That's why the context matters. Other than that, there's no real argument against the equality of Roger and Garp. Oda clearly made an effort to develop their rivalry despite the lack of screen time, to the point that over the course of their death matches, Roger grew to respect Garp like a comrade and trusted him to raise his son Ace. Despite being natural enemies as a marine and pirate, they joined forces to take down the Rocks pirates on God's Valley. Although most may consider Whitebeard to have been the strongest rivalry with Roger, Garp arguably has a stronger one, which reflects well in the equality of their strength. Now for the last group, which is called the strongest class, we have Whitebeard and Rocks. Whitebeard was known as the strongest man even in Roger's era, and Rocks was known as Roger's strongest foe. This will probably be the most contentious one, hence why I left them for last. In the era prior to Roger's, it was dominated by Rocks. He had the strongest crew, housing young Whitebeard, Shiki, Big Mom, and Kaido. He was ultimately defeated in God's Valley by the combined efforts of Marines led by Garp and the Roger pirates. The fact that Rocks could lead a crew so strong that it required two of the strongest of all time teaming up to defeat him speaks greatly to his strength. As for Whitebeard, he reached the peak of his strength by age 38, which is 2 years after the Rocks pirate fell. So it doesn't matter that Whitebeard was once a subordinate of Roger, he had got stronger since then, so it changes things. He was also known, like I said, as the strongest man even in Roger's era. He has one of the strongest devil fruits, that being the Gorogoro no Mi, which is a paramecia on the level of the Logias, which are the highest ranked devil fruits. The Whitebeard pirates fought against the Roger pirates many times, and on one of those occasions, as we saw in the Odin flashback, Whitebeard was so strong that he could clash equally against Roger's Conqueror's Haki attack without even using his devil fruit, which goes to show how strong Whitebeard's Haki is even without using his devil fruit. So that's not necessarily to say that they were going all out, which obviously they clearly weren't, but it definitely, like I said, is a testament to Whitebeard's strength. Now as for who is stronger between Rocks and Whitebeard, it becomes a little dicey. Sengoku says that Rocks was Roger's first and perhaps his greatest foe. The word perhaps suggesting that there's a possibility that he wasn't, and that Sengoku is uncertain, which makes this whole thing debatable. However, in the Road to Laughter booklet, which has canon information to the manga, it flat out states that Rocks was Roger's strongest adversary. So since Whitebeard was also an adversary of Roger, that means Rocks is stronger, right? Well, even though it should be this simple, there is also a similar statement said about Whitebeard. It's stated in deep blue that Whitebeard is Roger's greatest rival. So now we're dealing with two seemingly conflicting statements. This daybook came out in 2012. So maybe Oda never came up with the idea of Rocks, or that he would be Roger's strongest foe. However, there's no way of knowing if this was an intentional retcon unless the man comes out and says it himself, or one of his editors says it for him. So you can't objectively use this as an argument. You could also argue that being the greatest rival doesn't necessarily mean being the strongest one, and could be referring to fame, notoriety, or influence, as Whitebeard does have a higher bounty than Rocks. However, the statement in full is that Whitebeard is the greatest rival and competed for supremacy, which is more so a contest of strength than influence, notoriety, and fame. Now, an interesting argument to think about in favor of Whitebeard is actually the comparison of their bounties. Now, bounties aren't power levels. They're not supposed to accurately represent one's strength. Having a higher bounty doesn't necessarily mean being stronger. However, in the case of Rocks and Whitebeard, I do think it is interesting to compare. Aokiji explains that one's bounty is determined by their individual strength and how much of a threat they are to the government. Rocks' ambition was to become the king of the world, basically what Emu is, and he broke many of the world's taboos. Sengoku says that they opened hostilities directly against the world government like a terrorist organization. Robin explains that pirates don't usually initiate attacks on the world government, and the only organization to do so was the Revolutionary Army. So the Rocks crew are actually the only pirate crew ever to make attacking the world government directly their primary objective. Whitebeard, on the other hand, wasn't nearly as much of an aggressor to the world government the way Rocks was. Whitebeard's dream was having a family, and although he was still competing for supremacy on the seas, it didn't go much further than that. So despite Rocks seemingly being the bigger threat to the government, Whitebeard still has a higher bounty, which could mean that the Marines consider Whitebeard to be stronger than Rocks. Some may argue against this by saying that there's no public information about Rocks anymore, so his bounty wasn't considered by Brand New. However, the issue with this statement is, or this argument, is that Rocks must have had a bounty at the time of his era, and Brand New says that there's no bounty in pirating history that has surpassed Whitebeard and Rocks. Sengoku, who was teaching the young Marines about Rocks, doesn't object to Brand New's statement. Now that we've broken down all the 6 contenders, we can finally answer the question of who was the strongest in history. Firstly, we can immediately eliminate the greatest class, Roger and Garp. They just have no narrative or feats that gives them a case for being the strongest in their own era, let alone of all time. Being the Pirate King means Roger is the greatest pirate, as he was the first to circumnavigate the entire world, but that title doesn't mean he is the strongest. As for Whitebeard vs Rocks, Rocks has a more recent and stronger narrative of being Roger's strongest foe, with the whole God's Valley incident, being the captain of Fuji Yonko, etc. So Rocks being the strongest pirate in history makes sense. However, either opinion is still a fair take, and if you consider the whole bounty argument, then it does lean in Whitebeard's favour. Now, as for who the strongest in history is, it will more than likely be Joy Boy. Even though the information on him as of this recording doesn't objectively show this, and if we were to just go on basically what we know right now, he'd be bottom 2, considering what he represents in the story as basically the Hashirama to Luffy's Naruto. I'd bank on Joy Boy being the strongest, especially considering how Oda loves to choke on Luffy's chicken. As for Ryuma, if his epithet as the God of the Blade isn't considered against the entire cast, then if we go off strictly what we know as of this recording, he'd likely be the weakest of the 6. If not, he could be the strongest swordsman of all time, making him second to Joy Boy. Similarly with Joy Boy, Ryuma having a strong parallel with Zoro, who will likely be the future strongest swordsman of all time, does give him a good chance of him being the strongest to ever wield a blade. So if I were to rank them from strongest to weakest, this is how the list would look like. With all that said, if you enjoyed this, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell. That would be much appreciated. I've been the one and only Sage, and until next time.